In section 2.5, we're going to talk about addition and subtraction properties. And in this, several theorems that have to do with adding and subtracting segments together in order to get congruent segments and or angles. Let's start with the first one. If we have two congruent angles, and we add one segment to the end of each one, the new segments are also congruent. This is the first basic theorem. If a segment is added to two congruent segments, then the sums are now congruent. The same can be said with two congruent angles. If we have two congruent angles, but we add exactly the same angle to each of those congruent angles, now the sum of those angles will now be congruent. Similar to the first two theorems we just saw, if we have two congruent angles or segments, and we have another two congruent segments, if we add the one congruent segments to the other, then those sums will then be congruent. The same can be said with angles. If I have two congruent angles, which are added to two different congruent angles, their sums will also be congruent. Now, the difference between these two theorems that we just saw and the top two is in the top two, the segment being added is exactly the same as with the angles. It's the same angle being added. Whereas in these next two, even though the segments are congruent or the angles are congruent, these are two distinct angles, and these are two separate and distinct segments from each other. Similar to the addition properties, we can do the same with subtraction. If we have two congruent segments and we subtract the exact same segment, from each of those segments, the difference in the segments will now be congruent. The same can be said if I have two congruent segments and I take away congruent segments from each one. The resulting difference will be congruent. Again, the difference between these two theorems is this is the same segment, while this is a congruent segment.